All right, I was recruited to introduce Jill, our speaker today, Jill Johnson-Young, licensed clinical social worker. Jill is the clinical director and one of the co-founders of Central Counseling Services in Riverside. She specializes in providing services for people going through grief and loss, dementia, trauma, and adoption issues. She has 10 years experience working with hospice and has created a year-long grief support program called Your Path Through Grief. She facilitates a dementia support group, and she has authored 2 books, including a children's book called Someone is Sick, How Do I Say Goodbye? She's going to talk to us today about the issue of when your client is dying, what do I do or say? Hello, Jill. Thank you.
It is really nice to be here. Thank you for coming out today. It's also nice to see I've got so many fellow hospice folks. Hospice is one of my favorite places, as well as Dementia Land, which is the other subspecialty that I have. So we're going to talk about something that's come up a lot recently if you're on any of the online therapist groups. Is anyone in any of those on Facebook? None of you. Oh, some of you. This is not a hand-raising group, is it? Okay, to be in a Jill presentation, you have to interact, or I'll fire you all. Okay, let's just be clear about that. So we need to know what to do when someone comes in and they have been ill and now they are terminally ill, or they come to see you because they are dying, and or they're family members of someone who's dying. We want to be able to do that in a way that's going to support them, and we're not going to have the average treatment plan for that situation, because there's also some really nuts and bolts practical stuff that we don't usually talk about unless you happen to be like me and your office manager is a licensed funeral director and embalmer, right? There we go. This is supposed to, let's try that again. There we go. So the goals that we have for today, I want to make sure that you know what barriers are in your way in terms of providing the best services for your dying clients, and how your own experiences might impact how you're working with your client. Anybody experienced that so far? Yeah. We want to increase your knowledge on the impact grief can have, because it has a global impact on you physically, cognitively, emotionally, and it's not something that's really well known. People who are grieving don't know that the reason they're exhausted is because their brain is grieving, and it causes its own form of exhaustion. And if we can educate people better, we're going to be better therapists for them. We also want to have a treatment plan that's realistic, because folks who are terminally ill can't always make it on time, and they don't always know if they're going to have to cancel the hour before. And sometimes we need to be a little flexible in how we treat folks who are very sick. I've got handouts for you. Did everyone get a handout? All right. Good. In the back there are some resources. There's a lot of links, because if I printed everything I wanted you to have, you'd be living with a notebook each, and then you wouldn't look at it, because none of you even read the newsletter around here. So now you've got the links, and you can put them on your favorite places on your computer if you need them. Some of those also include things to support family members. There are some links for children, because I think that when we're dealing with someone who's dying, we're not dealing with just our client. We're dealing with the family, and we're dealing with all the other folks impacted. And I also want to talk a little bit about self-care. That's a big thing for all of us now in what we do. But when you are working with someone who is terminally ill, how many hospice folks do we have here? Raise their hands. I really mean raise your hands, right? You got to do self-care, don't you? Because if you don't, and you take this home with you every single day, then you are not going to be the most effective therapist, and you're going to wear yourself out. And you care enough to be here, so you're good therapists, obviously, and we want to make sure you're taking good care of yourselves. But we also, when someone dies, we need to acknowledge their death, right? There's been scuttlebutt in a couple groups recently that says, my client just died, should I go to the service? You know, what happens with HIPAA? And those are things you can discuss with your client ahead of time, so if that's something that you feel a need to do or you want to do, you can, or you can find your own rituals. So we'll talk some about that. Now, the reason that I do this is not only because I did hospice for more than 10 years in 2 states, which I do love, and I also do this at the office, and I happen to spend my evenings with a mortician in the back, but I'm also a double widow, and so been married 3 times. How many people can say that before they're 52, right? And I'm married to a funeral director. You got to be really, really brave to marry the Jill. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about it both from my perspective as a professional, but also because this is what we do day and night at our house. And I really think you got to be good at it. When my first wife was dying, she went to say goodbye to a therapist she'd been seeing, and the therapist said, "Oh, you don't need to say goodbye. You're not dying. You're not going to die." Really? She had pulmonary fibrosis. There is no way out of that one. And we knew. But that therapist was so uncomfortable with it, he literally stepped back and wouldn't say the words. So I very helpfully went by the week after the funeral and gave them a funeral handout and said, "Yes, she really meant it." Right? Because I'm a little confrontational sometimes too. Can you imagine that? I'm a social worker, right? It's what we do. So your own experience with death and grief, it makes a difference. And you folks have had a lot of grief around here recently. In Southern California, we watched your fires with horror. We had our own right nearby as well. And we had a lot of folks who had family members up here. So just so that you know, Southern California was keeping all of you in mind. Have you been present? Has anyone here been present during the dying process or had a client who's terminally ill? All right. Anybody ever forgotten that moment? Yeah. How many of you were prepared for it? Knew what you were going to see, hear, smell, experience? All right. We got some work to do, don't we? Because if that's your experience, that's what your client and their families are going through too. Significant grief experiences. I know I talked to somebody here who just lost a beloved niece last week. Have we had some other grief experiences recently? Yeah. They really do make a difference. And we have to remember how we dealt with things and also make sure that our grief doesn't become part of our client's grief, but that we're well in tune with what it was like for us, so that if there are things that we could have done better for ourselves, we can perhaps bring that to the plate. And the other thing I'd like you to think about is, can you be comfortable in grief land, which is what I call it? Because when you have lost somebody, your world changes. You are not waking up the same person. And every time you wake up for that first month or so, they die all over again, don't they? Especially if it's a spouse or a pet. How many of you have beloved pets at your house? Right? And when they die, it matters just as much, doesn't it? And when you have a client who's had a pet die, that matters to them, right? We have 3 poodles at our office. If you look on our company website, you will see 3 oodles. We call them oodles of poodles, and they're very well dressed. But our senior poodle, Fuzzy, is now 17 and is terminally ill herself. And we're preparing our staff and our young clients for that. She's becoming part of Griefland, so they're learning how to inhabit it. If you are likely to be triggered, I want to warn you ahead of time, I am going to go through some of the dying process. So I'll give you a heads up before we get there, so that if you want to step out, you can. The language we use. That's Fuzzy, by the way. That was a number of years ago when she was still a little bit healthier. What language do we use to describe illnesses when we know that someone is dying? How do we say the words? What things do we say? What have you heard? Terminal. How many are comfortable saying that word? Uh-huh. How many of you have heard people say, "No, I'm just sick and I'm trying to get better," or they don't even want to say that they're sick, or their families don't want to say that they're sick? Do we say things like, "Oh, I'm stage 3 or stage 4"? When you get to stage 4, if we're talking about cancer, there isn't a whole lot to get through that. It may become more chronic, but at some point, stage 4 cancer is not your friend anymore, right? And we sometimes say things like, "Well, they're not doing so well," right? They're not doing so well. No, they're dying. That is what they are doing. And if you can help the family members say those words, it makes it more of a reality for them. And we need that reality base so that we're not in denial. We've already moved into Griefland by the time that death occurs. The folks who actually prepare for a death, the family members who have started reorganizing their world before their loved one dies. They're already thinking about how it's going to impact them emotionally, how they're going to live their life, their finances. That's a big deal. If they're already thinking about who they're going to be without that brother or sister or spouse or son or daughter, they do remarkably better than the folks who don't think about it, the ones who put it out here. There's some recent studies that just came out about a year ago, and it showed that the folks who do that are on their way to recovery within 3 to 4 months. And they don't need grief groups. When they say, I don't need a group, they mean it. They're the people who don't need groups. And they're the ones who stay alive. As opposed to the ones who don't want to do that, those are the ones who are 60% more likely to be gone in 5 years. So there's a reason we need to do this. This is important work. And the reason we need to use the words. It's important. Now for the dying person and the dying process, what words do we say? How many of you heard someone say, I don't want them to quit? Right? I'm not sure quitting was part of dying. I'm really not. Now, some people do say, I don't want treatment anymore. That's not quitting. At least in my book, that's self-care. Because sometimes that treatment is far more brutal than being able to have a peaceful end in life, right? Or we say, no, you can't stop fighting. Don't give up. When a dying person hears that, how do they receive that? Guilt. Majorly guilt. And then after the death, the person who said that, guilt. Just the same. Because they were saying what they thought they should say. They didn't want that person to die, but they used words that were laden with emotions and that probably weren't the most fair emotions they could have been using. Or you're just not trying enough. I've had hospice patients where I've walked in and there's a refrigerator side by side in the living room, and they have brought in hundreds of pounds, I'm not kidding, of vegetables and fruits. And they are juicing for all they're worth. And this patient is days from dying, and they are still juicing and trying to force that patient to eat this green stuff. Now, I'm never going to go to Juice It Up and buy green stuff. I'm just going to say that right there, and kale's not my friend. But when someone's dying, they deserve to have ice cream if that's what they want. And if they want ice cream with a Kahlua chaser, so much the better, right? Yeah, our doctor gave us permission at our house to use morphine and Cabernet at the same time. Worked marvelously, I have to say. So maybe a more realistic expectation and more realistic words and some laughter, because if you can't laugh while you're doing this work, you're not going to get through it. And your families need to know it's okay to laugh. They should be able to laugh if they're on their way to the cemetery too. There are parts in our lives that have to be funny even when they're hard, right? Now for the family system, what do we tell them? What are the expectations? How many of you have been with a dying person and a well-intentioned person walks up and says, I'm praying for a miracle. I lit some candles today. You're going to be just fine. I had a hospice nurse who was a friend of ours say that at one point because she didn't want my hospice nurse spouse to die. It's not real. Sometimes the miracle is something entirely differently than what you were hoping for. Or we're going to find a cure. We're going to work on it. I'm going to spend all my time finding a cure. Right? How many of you have heard that? You've heard about coconut oil? Forgive me if you like coconut oil. It's really good for your skin and your hair. But our hospice docs used to say if you really want to help someone who's dying with coconut oil, put it on the floor so they'll slide out faster. Because it's not going to do anything for the illness, but it will clog those arteries effectively and efficiently. Now, when you work for hospice, there is kind of a closed-door sense of humor. Just like in child welfare, we had closed-door sense of humor. Just like as therapists, we have closed-door sense of humor. So some of that might slip out today, and I apologize in advance. Okay? You might also hear someone say to a family member, you haven't said goodbye. You haven't given them permission to go. You're keeping them here. Any of you been on the receiving end of that one? Yeah. What was that like?
It was my husband who said, you're keeping me here.
Ooh.
And I said, honey, I love you very much, but I'm ready to be done with this too.
Yes.
And he said, oh, I guess it's me.
I think it was related to my first wife, actually. We had some of the same conversation. But did someone else raise their hand? When someone hears that, perhaps not from the dying spouse, then that person dies, they have that guilt and that anxiety that they caused this to go on and on. Yes, it's nice if we can say that it's okay for someone to go. But if a family member can't say those words, there are alternatives. I am going to miss you like crazy. I'm so sad this is happening. I will remember this, this, and this about you. That's a permission giving without saying the words, if those words are too hard. We have lots of words we can use, and we can be creative with them and not carry the guilt that some of these phrases carry with them. And that's part of what we do as therapists, I hope, is to inoculate our families from those words before they hear them, or to undo some of the damage if they have heard them. I do a lot of that in my office each and every day. I was doing 2 or 3 hours of that just the other day, as a matter of fact. We also hear them being told, you need to take all the time off you need. How many of you who work full-time for an agency can take off all the time that you need anytime you please? Right? Have hours and oodles of vacation time. Now, sometimes we do have that, but sometimes family members can't take time off. We are not lifetime. We have to actually do the work to support the rest of the family. So putting that on a family member is really hard for them, and it induces anxiety. Oh my gosh, I should be home. In all the best possible worlds, you would be home all the time. In the reality of the world, you may not be able to. You all have clients you have to see, right? You can't shut down your practice much of the time. And we also hear families being told, you know, it'd be so good if all of you could get along. Dying people are great for this. What I want before I die is for all of you to make amends. I want to hear all of you say that you love each other, right? We want North Korea to get along with us too right now, don't we? About the same kind of ability that we're going to have for some families. I have sat with hospice families where they literally were throwing pots and pans over the bed of the dying patient who had a glioblastoma, right? Because people die the way they live, and families experience dying the way they live. We don't have a magic wand. I wish I did. I would love to have had that fairy dust to make it better, but families are who families are. And you don't have enough time in your practice to fix a family in time for someone to die and have everyone get along, right? Not even Gottman can do that for couples. And I know Gottman well enough to know that, right? All right. Next slide. And then what do we say to grieving people? Do any of you have some phrases you just can't stand hearing? I have a 5-page list. Way in the back. They're in a better place. That is one of the number 3 top hits for grieving people. Yes, ma'am. Everything happens for a reason. Things happen because of cancer sometimes, right? If we're looking for that reason, what happens? That means somebody chose for your loved one to die. And now you're supposed to find some vision from it and make something out of it. Now you can find some healing after a death, don't hear me wrong. But not for a reason. We don't choose for people to die. What are some of the others? I have a 5-page list. Kids even contribute to it. You're missing one of the top ones, and it's Christmas time. You should get this one. Time will make it better. Time heals all wounds. How about God needed another angel? See, Christmas time, angels, we got that, right? Because when you tell that to a child and you're talking to a little person, and you say, God needed your mommy to be an angel, what is that child thinking? God's going to come for me, or God could have taken your mommy. She could have been the angel. I don't know why he wanted my mommy, right? We had a really dear friend at our church who was dying. She was the one who did everything with every age youth in our church. She went on whitewater rafting trips and took them to Arizona to see the ruins. They all adored her, seniors through the tiny tots. And we had to go tell our Sunday schoolers that Mari was dying. Now they'd know Mari was sick, but we had to go do the process ahead of time so they could say goodbye. And we went into one classroom where my niece and nephew were actually sitting, and we talked about her dying and saying goodbye, and this is bargaining. Okay, but Aunt Jill, what if we give God grandma and we get to keep Mari? Because she's old and she's not as much fun, right? Kids are concrete when you're talking about dying. So those are some of the phrases. Any other phrases that you think up off the top of your head? Yes, ma'am. Gone to a better place. right? Oh, they're healed now. They're in a better place. No, better place would be they never got sick or they never got hit by that truck, and they were right here. They had a good life. They lived a long life. Did you hear all the comments about that with Bush when he died? Regardless of your politics, he was 94. He lived a good life. Yeah, but those were some grieving children watching that funeral, weren't they? Yeah, on international TV. Can you imagine? What other ones? Yes? You'll be in heaven with your loved one. Tell that to a teenager. Suicide. We don't need that. It's okay. They were old. You're still waking up and they're still dead and you're still sad. That doesn't make grief go away. Yes? Love that one. Yes, yes, yes. Or, Jesus didn't cry. I'm like, you know what? I think there was a phrase in there that said Jesus wept. Right? I'm not a Christian therapist, by the way, but I can quote most of the major ones when it comes to grief and loss. You got to get good at this stuff, right? So when we are using language toward people who are grieving, we need to make sure that we give them space. If you are seeing a grieving family, first thing I do with a client is tell me your story. And that may take 3 or 4 sessions depending on what they're working through. Second thing is, what are the things you've heard that were not helpful? You can spend an entire session on that, just holding space. If you're working with a family or who's got someone dying, you can prepare them ahead of time, and you can help them to understand that folks are saying stuff to fill up space. Because most of us in our society are not good at just holding space, are we? Even therapists sometimes are not. You say, tell me about your loved one dying, and someone starts to cry. Your job is to just sit there and let them get to it when they're done and they feel like they're safe with you, right? So filling up space with words sometimes can be harmful and hurtful, and we don't know that. And sometimes we say things like, well, you should be over this by now. It's been 2 weeks since the funeral, right? Right. I was watching a major network news anchor talk about having a member of the band who had been on stage in Wembley Stadium. Do you remember Wembley with the mass shooting? And they said, oh, they just called in. They said they're not coming. It's been too soon. And they looked puzzled. And I didn't throw my TV at my shoe at the TV quite yet. And then they said, it's been a week? Yeah. That's how we do death and dying in our culture now. So what I want to do, because I do like doing interactive stuff, but I hate making people role play all the time, is I want to talk about, maybe between amongst yourselves, or we'll do it between us, some situations that you will be facing if you are doing this work. Your client is terminally ill. How do you ask how they're doing? What do you say? Do you say, are you doing okay? What's the answer going to be? Absolutely. I'm hanging in there. I don't want to upset you. You're my therapist. You're going to be sad I'm not doing well. Right? Instead, how about, did you sleep last night or was it too hard? Were you able to get some food down? Are you finding difficulties with new things? Opens up all kinds of avenues, doesn't it? To talk about what's going on. You can't use open-ended questions when you're doing death and dying. Have you noticed that? Are you implying when you're asking them questions that they are better than they feel? One of the number one complaints my chronically to terminally ill clients have, and my spouses did as well, were someone would say, but you look so good. You look really good today. What did that make them feel? Well, I better be feeling good. Let me not tell anyone that I'm feeling lousy. No, they're trying to look good, but they're not good. And they would really like someone to acknowledge that, please. Are you implying that you are accepting that they are dying? Do they know that you're accepting that they're dying? How do you say that? Ideas. Some of the things I do, and that I suggest families do, is to pull together a circle with the entire family or with several sets of family if the family are the pots and pans variety, because we don't want warfare, right? And you can do this in your office if someone is doing better, or they can do it at home if they're not. And you spend some time with everybody sharing something they will remember about them, something that they will carry with them, how they will live on in them after the death. Because that's telling the person that they're dying, yes, and they want them to be part of them, yes.
So I'm just imagining talking with the client
Mm-hmm.
about releases to talk with the family and that conversation and just trying to see where to be sensitive and skillful in that conversation.
So that would be something that you would talk with the client well beforehand, and the client would have to say they're comfortable, or you can prepare the client or the family member to do this at home. You don't have to have everybody there. But if the client comes to your office with the family group and they want to come in together, then you've got implied consent because they're inviting them in. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that one.
And especially if you're telling them this is what we're doing.
And then after the client's passed, when family members are looking for resolution or connection or support, that becomes another release moment as well.
I get permission ahead of time. Yeah, if I know that there are family members I've seen in the context of the person dying, then I get releases ahead of time, and I also get permission from the person who's dying to see their family members for follow-up. And that way they know there's continuity. Yep. In hospice, you don't have quite the same situation, which is handy. Yes?
I don't know if I heard you right, but did you say that the person dying can be living on in the other,
Yes.
they can be living on in the other person?
They can live on in me. So I will always, Grandpa, I'm always going to remember you teaching me how to fish. And every time I go fishing or I see your fishing pole, you're going to be part of that. And then I'm going to teach my kids to fish, and I'm going to talk about you. And so you're going to be part of teaching my kids to fish, my kids who aren't even born yet. So we carry that person's legacy or that person's identity, that person's special parts into the new life as we're reorganizing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that part does, but the person living on in them, I don't know. I have a hard time with that.
Just a phrase. You can certainly use your own phrases. I'm not telling you the words to use. But the concept is, you had something special. We had a good relationship. There were some parts of you that were really important. And I'm going to carry that on with me. Your sense of humor, your horrible, corny jokes, right? The fact that you were a therapist, and I used to say, don't use your therapist voice on me, right? What are some of the things folks are going to remember about you that they're going to carry on, right? My kids are going to remember pot roast. They're not going to remember making cookies with me, right? But they'll remember that part. Other thoughts? Yes?
I know families remember
Here's the microphone.
their family member was dying, and they gave a memorial service for the person while the dying person was alive, and that person got to hear all the things that they loved about her.
That's why I like
That
the
was
circles.
amazing.
Absolutely.
That was really amazing. Yeah.
Wakes should include the dying person, personally. That's my theory. Yeah, because people need to hear that they're going to be important and they're going to live on, and that's a permission giving, because you're always going to be part of me. You're always going to go on with us. We're going to talk about you. Yes, we're going to talk about you. Right? You can make fun with this stuff too. You can have fun with it, but you've got to be able to say the words, and it gives the family some context, right? And it gives the person who's dying permission to talk about dying. Do your office policies, good on the discussion about the releases, meet the needs of the dying person? How many of you have really strict policies about if you don't call 24 hours or 36 hours or 48 hours ahead of time, there's going to be a fee? I know some of you do. Yeah. Would you bend that, would be the question, for someone who's very ill? And would your office policies allow for that if you don't own your practice? In my office, the folks who are very ill get early morning appointments, mostly because early morning is when they're functioning better. But it also means if they have to cancel last minute, I've got time to do paperwork. So it works for me, it works for them. I can also do phone appointments. We can do video, if they're up to video. Sometimes they're not up to that either. So you have to be a little more flexible when you're doing work with folks who are dying, because they're not as able to be flexible with you. They can't keep every Wednesday at 1 o'clock sometimes. All right? And can you give them a safe space to explore their beliefs, their fears, their concerns? I heard some folks who were doing Catholic work and Christian work, which is fabulous. Sometimes, though, when someone's dying, God is not their best friend. They're a little bit pissed off. And when a family is grieving, definitely not the best time to say lean on prayer, unless they're telling you that's what they're doing. Folks who even have had the very strongest of belief systems, when someone has died or someone is dying, those systems are being challenged. And if you're referencing them as something they should be doing, then you're shutting down their ability to talk about how angry they are, how upset they are, how God should have found a cure for them, how if they'd only lived a better life, this wouldn't be happening. Wait, microphone, where are we? Here we go.
I did hospice when I worked in Missouri. I was in a very, very rural area, which very, very conservative. And one of my worst moments was a woman was having an incredible amount of trauma around the fact that she felt she'd lived a good life. I mean, there was nothing in it to make, like, she wasn't a serial killer, but she was, sure that she was going to hell, and it was causing her a lot of angst, and I got screamed at by the chaplain because I said, I just don't, I'm trying to understand why you would think God would do that. And, I was put in my place for not saying that. So I'm wondering what you would do with people that have that idea that they're going to hell and she just kept saying, I'm gonna be in a cold, dark place, and and I don't know her, I didn't know her whole story, so who knows what was going really on, but how do you address that?
Oh, I ran into that a lot. Did I mention the hospice I worked for was in rural Central Florida? Yeah, we had a church on every corner, and all summer long we had kids' Bible camps, which are wonderful, but lots of them had flames underneath the advertising. Yeah, so that was a strong concept there. We also had a lot of folks from the Caribbean. So we also had we had a couple of patients who identified as dying because they had spells that had been inflicted on them. And we actually brought people out to lift the spells. And we had the chaplain help, because it's always good to do cross-cultural training, is it not? So if someone was feeling like they were being essentially damned to hell for anything in their life, I tried to get quickly into the trauma and into, again, what you were doing, where the thought process was coming from, and gave them permission to think otherwise about that and to talk about the good things they'd done in their life and the legacy they were leaving behind, the kids that they'd raised, the work that they'd done, and I tried to reframe it enough times that we could talk about, I know you were thinking that way, I'm so glad that you're able to think about something other than that, because with your belief system, you also have a belief in going to heaven, would be my assumption if that's the discussion. And tell me why God would not bring you there, because according to your belief system, again, not referencing mine, according to your belief system, if you hold on to your beliefs and you express a certain belief, you've got a door open, right? And so I reframe it. Chaplains don't usually, especially in rural areas, go that route. So I would do it on a day that I knew he wasn't there, and I'd warn the nurses and they'd redirect him so that he stayed out of the house for at least 2 days, so that I had that moment with them. Yeah, it's tricky sometimes when you're doing that stuff. There was another, yes?
I was just going to say, just to remember that when my 103-year-old grandmother was dying of cancer, throat cancer, a coworker came up to me and said, "Your grandmother is atoning for her sins." And I said, I think living 103 years is atoning enough.
Good for you. Yeah, people hear stuff, don't they? They hear a lot of stuff. And they also, people who are on oxygen will sometimes go out in public and hear people say, well, that's what you get for smoking all those years. You know, the majority of people with lung cancer have never smoked a day in their life, right? Presumptions are a dangerous thing and not very nice. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just quick comment is if, I have a family where there was a sudden loss of a child. So it feels like your orientation is towards the hospice, the dying process. But what happens, or maybe you can just consider and integrate or speak to that the aftermath of a sudden death. Thank you.
I was actually going to roll that in, but yeah, this was more about someone who is dying, but yes, sudden death is a totally different box of rocks. I have probably an equal number of clients who are facing sudden deaths, many of them traumatic young deaths, which is where those accidents tend to happen because our teenage drivers are not the most skilled, are they? Right, so when someone has had a sudden death, then the questions are very different, and a lot of the trauma comes from that dying process. Because when someone has had a sudden death and is traumatic, much of the time the family can't even see the body because there's just been too much trauma. And that's one of the largest traumas. Has anyone else shared that experience? That you just can't, the mortuary or the coroner's office will say this is just, they're not viewable. That's the technical term. And they're angry about it and they want to know why somebody would deny them that. And you really have to go through the whole accident or the whole experience. And these people were trying to prevent you from having an even uglier memory. And we need to work on why they died and how they died. Lots of times somebody has fallen asleep at the wheel, someone is DUI, somebody suicided, those sorts of things. And so we have to go through that process of the forgiveness of the decision-making process that brought them to that death. And facing the accident scene as well, going back and revisiting it. First there and then there. Yes?
In terms of being able to view the body, I work with a lot of people who can't afford to pay to see the body of their loved one. And so that's a whole nother issue.
Mortuaries, especially the smaller ones, the family-owned ones, not the big ones with the big sign at the bottom with a company called Dignity, that's not going to be affordable. But the other ones will do what they call an ID view, which doesn't involve embalming, but it does involve someone preparing them enough to be able to be viewed. And they will do that just with a simple shroud, usually at their mortuary office.
The people I work with don't even have enough money for that. I've looked into it before. They're on SSI.
If you find the right mortuary, sometimes things happen. You just have to know which ones to work with and who to go to. There are also some nonprofits in virtually every area that do provide support for some of those things. And they will do a quick view and then a simple cremation so that the immediate family members do have that option. You don't want to view someone at a coroner's office. I will warn you now. You want a mortician to be able to have made that in-between step for you. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, you always want the small family mortuaries because they are the ones who typically will step in and step up. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you if you might want to make a bit of a separation between sudden other deaths that you've named and suicide, because I think it really ushers in a whole other set of questions and mix of feelings among the family.
Yeah, suicide is another lecture unto itself because there are so many emotions and there's so many situations and there's so much involved in it. But in terms of a suicide loss, when you're talking with a family member about it, it's walking through the death process, walking through what they are blaming themselves for, because there's always self-blame among family members when someone has killed themselves. And then there's always anger about the person who chose to die. And you work through each of those individually, and you give them space. They're allowed to be angry. One of the things we don't do well in our society is give people permission to be angry at the dead person, right? They're dead. They are supposed to be angels, and they are suddenly perfect. Even that abusive father is suddenly the best dad anyone has ever had, right? What I love is that we've got some new obituaries in the papers occurring now where someone has died from an opiate addiction, and we've got parents who are actually writing about the addictions, and we do have some who are writing about the suicides. I tend to cut and paste those and save them for future reference when I need them, but you can find them if you Google them, and there are families who write about those things openly and honestly. And it helps for survivors to see that other families have walked that walk and have been willing to talk about it. I refer my suicide survivor families to the suicide survivor walks, which they hold nationwide. They happen once a year in large areas. I know you have a few up here. And you're surrounded by other family members who've had someone die of suicide. And typically people make shirts with their loved one's face and their name on it and their dates on it. And you are meeting everybody there who's ever had somebody else suicide. And lots of times there are therapists there and other folks there for support. But it gives them that chance to connect with people who've had the same loss, which is really important in that kind of loss. So we give them that space and we give them that support. Microphone's coming your way.
So one of the things I personally hate in obituaries is the lines about after a brave struggle, they
I do
fought
too.
hard. And I'm thinking, oh, do you have to fight hard? Do you have to be so brave? What if you say, I know where this is ending.
Right.
I don't want to go through this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to fight it. Or, I'm even going to do I'm going to do
Assisted death.
suicide, assisted death or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it sets up this assumption that we have to, we just have to do whatever we can to fight it. And it's like a battle and a war. And sometimes saying, I've met my match.
I'm not doing this anymore.
I'm not doing this anymore. I don't want to live like this. And so I would really, when I read obituaries you're talking about like that, I love them too because they're bringing it out of the closet and normalizing something. But I also like to see that people do not have to fight a hard battle.
Right.
They do. But still, I don't like that being seen as somehow
necessary,
required, or
required,
better, or you're a more noble person because you actually fought it to the end.
You died a good death, a better death than the person who chose not to do chemo, right? And that's why I don't like the phrases we use toward people who are dying. You got to fight harder. You got to try harder. You're giving up. No, they're making choices. Yes.
Hi, yes. I had a client that suicided, and her sister said that she had left a letter for me. And when I got the letter, it also had a check in there because she wanted her sister and her stepdaughter to come one time and talk with me.
Wow.
And it was such a powerful session. I was an intern at the time, and I remember being reminded, know who your client is, know who your client is. But it was such a healing time, and there was also laughter and tears, and I could be there for them as a kind of a connection between them and my client. Yeah.
That is a powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. And what a thing to experience as an intern. My goodness. That client must have known you had the heart for that. Yes.
I've read an article recently about a sort of growing number of people that are writing their own obituaries.
Mm-hmm.
That seems interesting, to find a way to express something important to you. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, we do those at our house. Before you die, you have to write your own obituary. It's in the rules when you join the family. But yes, I work with clients who are writing their own, or if they want to write it with someone in particular. And if I've got someone who I'm only seeing after a death, especially a traumatic death, typically in a traumatic death, people try to protect the immediate family. And so somebody else steps up and writes the obituary and plans the funeral. Huge trauma, because then it's not their funeral. And it's not their obituary, and it's not their memory. And so for those folks, I have them on the anniversary write their own obituary on the first anniversary so that they can describe the person they lost and describe the death that they experienced. But yeah, I think it's very healing for folks to write their own obituaries. It lets them decide what they want in it. If they want to pick their own pictures for the memorial video, because everyone has a memorial video these days, right? So let them pick their own pictures. And that way you don't get blamed if it's not the pictures the family wanted, because you can say, no, you can't blame me, the dying person did it. And you can't criticize them, they're an angel after all now, right? So, yeah, I like the client being involved in as much as they can. Pick the music, pick the casket, pick the gravesite if there's going to be one, right? or pick the tree they want to become if they're going to go into a pod. We're going to talk about that too. Yes?
Hi. In the Jewish tradition, which probably isn't followed, they have what is called an ethical will.
Yes.
And so I took a class and we all did it, but for a dying person, if they hadn't done it before, it's a nice way to write down like what you've learned in life or your greatest experiences that you want your grandchildren to know, or so that there's actually a document that you get to work on as well as legacy. That's
Absolutely.
Very nice.
It is. It
do.
is. Thank you for bringing that up. I should have incorporated this. Yeah. One of the things I have clients who I know that we know are dying, I have them get recorded books. And if they've got young people in the family or they're going to be young people that they've never met, they record the storybooks in their own voice. So their kids can hear grandma or grandpa reading the book out loud long after grandma and grandpa are gone. Just make sure they pull the little tab so it can't be erased. Because kids are techno savvy and they will erase it and put their own name on it. And that causes all kinds of drama. All right. So are you able to help the partner see the transition from battling illness to having an outcome of death? Is that something we talked about there? You're able to do? Yes, they're not going to fight the battle anymore. They're going to choose a different route. They're going to choose to stop chemo. Or they can't help this. This is happening to them. And helping that family understand that that's the transition we're in right now. Are we making sure our clients and their families have a support system? Whatever that support system might be. And it can be online. And are they understanding how their anticipatory grief is impacting the dying person? Because when we are grieving while someone's dying, we can impact each other in either a positive way or a negative way. And that's why I like talking about grief before someone dies. And what do they need from you to talk about the leftovers? Because in my perspective, when you are doing grief work, you're actually talking about the leftovers of the relationship. You're finishing the stuff that didn't get done. Whether or not it's a traumatic instant death or a death that's expected, there's always stuff left over. Yeah?
Open-ended questions don't belong in death and dying. And I just wanted to clarify that I think you said it in the context of the how are you doing question, because in the hospice world, we ask all kinds of open questions about all kinds of things. And so I just wanted to clarify that was a contextual
Right,
comment.
that was contextual. Right, when you're trying to encourage someone to talk about the tough stuff, and you give them permission to talk about it. Right? Thank you for clarifying that.